In the middle of July 2026, the lights went out across Cuba again. Not in one province, not for a few hours. The entire national electrical grid collapsed for the second time in a single week, marking the fourth major nationwide blackout of the year. For millions of people in Havana, Santiago de Cuba, Holguin, Camagüey, and the smaller towns that dot the island, the darkness stretched 18 hours, then 20, then in some rural areas, more than 22 hours straight. Hospitals switched to generators that sputtered and eventually fell silent when the fuel ran out. Families sat in their apartments by the weak glow of phone flashlights or cheap paraffin candles, the air thick with the smell of smoke from cooking fires lit on balconies. Children tried to finish homework by the light of a single bulb wired to a car battery. In the streets below, the only sounds were the occasional rumble of a government vehicle or the distant barking of dogs. This is not a temporary inconvenience caused by a hurricane or simple bad luck. This is the visible, accelerating death of a system that has run out of time, out of fuel, and out of the external lifelines that kept it breathing for more than 6 decades. For years, the Cuban government told its people and the watching world that the island was heroically resisting the American blockade and building a superior socialist model against all odds. The gleaming hospitals shown in state media, the literacy statistics, the defiant speeches at the United Nations, all of it painted a picture of resilience and moral victory. The reality on the ground, in the summer of 2026, tells a brutally different story. The power plants are ancient relics from another era. The fuel that once kept them running has been strangled at the source. The food that once arrived through state distribution networks is no longer showing up in reliable quantities. The doctors, engineers, and young professionals who kept the machinery of daily life functioning are leaving by the hundreds of thousands. What we are watching is not another difficult chapter in the long Cuban Revolution. It is the moment the socialist experiment on the island is visibly collapsing in real time. Exposed by the sudden loss of its last major external supporter and crushed under the weight of contradictions that decades of subsidies had hidden from view. To understand how Cuba reached this breaking point, you have to go back to the beginning of the story the regime still tells its people and itself. In January 1959, Fidel Castro and a small band of bearded rebels rode triumphantly into Havana after overthrowing the corrupt Batista dictatorship. They promised something genuinely revolutionary for Latin America at the time. Land reform that would give peasants ownership of the soil they worked, a massive literacy campaign that would teach every Cuban to read and write, universal health care that would reach the poorest rural villages, and true national independence from the economic and political domination of the United States. For a time, parts of that promise were delivered with impressive speed. Young volunteers fanned out across the countryside carrying blackboards and primers. Rural medical posts were constructed in places that had never seen a doctor. Infant mortality, which had been shockingly high under the old regime, began a steep decline that would eventually make Cuba a statistical outlier in the developing world. The revolution gave millions of ordinary Cubans, especially the poor and the black population that had been at the bottom of the old social order, a sense of dignity, purpose, and collective pride that many had never experienced before. It was a heady time, and the images of that early revolutionary enthusiasm still shape how the government presents itself today. But almost from the very beginning, the new system was built on a foundation that could never sustain itself without constant outside help. The United States responded to the nationalization of American-owned properties and Cuba's rapid turn toward Moscow with a comprehensive trade embargo that has now lasted more than 60 years. Cuba, facing economic isolation from its largest natural trading partner, turned to the Soviet Union for everything it could no longer obtain from the West: oil at subsidized prices, industrial machinery, food imports, weapons, and direct financial subsidies, that at their peak reached roughly $5 to $6 billion a year. The island essentially became a giant sugar plantation feeding the Soviet bloc while receiving cheap oil and manufactured goods in return. It was never self-sufficient socialism. It was subsidized socialism on an enormous scale, and it functioned only as long as the checks from Moscow kept arriving on time. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, those checks stopped almost overnight. What followed was the special period, one of the darkest and most traumatic chapters in modern Cuban history. Blackouts stretched up to 20 hours a day. The average Cuban lost roughly 20 pounds as caloric intake collapsed. There were documented reports of families eating cats, rats, and whatever else they could find. The regime survived that near collapse through a combination of harsh repression against any sign of dissent, limited and tightly controlled economic openings, such as international tourism and small private restaurants and taxi businesses, and the extraordinary resilience and patriotism of a population that had been taught for decades to view suffering as a necessary price of resistance to imperialism. But the fundamental lesson was never absorbed at the top. The system still required someone else's money and someone else's oil to keep functioning at even a minimal level. That someone else became Hugo Chávez's Venezuela, starting in the early 2000s. Caracas began sending Cuba hundreds of thousands of barrels of heavily discounted oil every single day in exchange for Cuban doctors, teachers, sports trainers, and security advisors who helped prop up the Bolivarian Revolution. At its height, Venezuela was supplying more than half of Cuba's total fuel needs. The arrangement kept the lights on in Cuban cities, the generators running in hospitals, the tractors moving in the fields, and the regime itself in power through another 2 decades of economic stagnation and demographic decline. It was the second great external oxygen tank. Without that steady flow of Venezuelan crude, the aging thermoelectric plants, the inefficient state agricultural system, and the rigid central planning apparatus would have been exposed to the full force of their own inefficiencies much earlier. But in 2026, that final lifeline was severed. Following the political collapse of the Maduro government in Venezuela earlier this year, and the effective American campaign to block alternative fuel shipments, including direct pressure on tankers and on countries like Mexico that had stepped in as alternative suppliers, the oil stopped flowing in anything close to the volumes Cuba required. What had been chronic grinding shortages suddenly became an acute society-wide emergency in a matter of weeks. The Cuban government did what it has always done. It blamed the imperialist blockade for every empty shelf and every dark neighborhood. Behind closed doors, however, officials were reportedly scrambling for urgent diplomatic openings and even authorizing the quiet release of some political prisoners as signals that the situation had become genuinely unsustainable. The results of that cutoff are now impossible to miss if you walk through any Cuban city after sunset. Cuba's electricity generation has always been overwhelmingly dependent on imported heavy fuel oil, burned in plants that were mostly built in the 1960s and 1970s and were already operating decades past their original design life. When the fuel does not arrive on schedule, the plants shut down one by one. Transmission lines that have received only minimal maintenance for years because of a lack of spare parts and hard currency fail under the additional strain. In 2026 alone, the country has already suffered at least 4 total nationwide blackouts, with the most recent cluster coming in rapid succession during the first half of July. Cuba's own energy ministry and the National Electric Union have publicly admitted generation shortfalls exceeding 1,300 to 1,700 megawatts during peak evening hours. In practical terms, that means large sections of the island are without reliable power for the majority of every single day. Hospitals have been forced to cancel, or indefinitely postpone more than 100,000 surgeries, including thousands of pediatric operations that cannot safely be delayed. Blood banks and diagnostic laboratories cannot maintain proper temperatures or run essential equipment. Water pumping stations that rely on electricity stop working, leaving more than 2 million people with only intermittent running water, or none at all, for days at a time. Garbage collection has ground to a halt in many neighborhoods because there is no fuel for the trucks. Piles of uncollected waste rot in the tropical heat, raising very real fears of cholera, dengue, and other disease outbreaks. Schools close when there is no power for fans in the brutal summer heat or even basic lighting for evening classes. Small private businesses that once scraped by on tourism or remittances now operate in the dark or simply lock their doors. The human cost behind those statistics is almost impossible to convey in numbers alone. Consider the daily reality for a typical family in a modest concrete apartment building in the Vedado neighborhood of Havana. A mother in her late 30s wakes before dawn because she knows the water might come on for only an hour or two. She fills every available container while her husband tries to get their 2 children ready for school. By mid-morning, the power has usually failed again. She has no gas for the stove because fuel deliveries to the neighborhood have been sporadic for months, so she cooks whatever she was able to buy on the black market over a small charcoal fire built on the balcony. The smoke drifting back into the living room, where her elderly father sits in a wheelchair, coughing, from the combination of heat, smoke, and poor air quality. The few pieces of chicken she managed to obtain are already beginning to spoil in the unrefrigerated heat. Her youngest child has had a persistent cough and fever for days, but the neighborhood clinic has been out of antibiotics for weeks, and the nearest functioning hospital is overwhelmed, running on a generator that may fail at any moment. This is not a rare or extreme case. It is the new normal for millions of Cubans. They stand in lines that stretch for blocks for whatever the ration book, known as the libreta, still provides. Small monthly allotments of rice, beans, sugar, and occasionally eggs or chicken that frequently never materialize. Prices on the informal market have exploded to levels that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. Any family with access to hard currency from relatives abroad spends it first on fuel for a generator, if they are fortunate enough to own one, or on medicines smuggled in from Miami or Panama. The official state economy has largely ceased to deliver the basics of daily life for ordinary people. The informal economy and black market are now the only mechanisms keeping millions from complete destitution. The healthcare system that was once the revolution's most powerful international calling card is now under siege in ways that shock even longtime Cuba watchers. Statements from the United Nations Human Rights Office and independent medical analyses describe a situation in which only around 30% of essential medicines are reliably available at any given moment. Infant mortality, which Cuba had proudly reduced to among the lowest rates in the entire developing world, has nearly doubled in recent years to 9.9 deaths per 1,000 live births. Childhood cancer survival rates have fallen from roughly 85% to around 65% because chemotherapy drugs, radiation equipment, basic supportive medications, and even reliable electricity for treatment facilities are unavailable or chronically unreliable. Doctors describe operating rooms where complex procedures are halted partway through when the power fails and backup systems cannot be maintained. Neonatal incubators run on generators that cannot be serviced because spare parts are blocked by sanctions or simply unaffordable. One physician in Santiago de Cuba told foreign journalists that his team is now forced to make life and death triage decisions about which patients receive the last remaining doses of certain antibiotics. These are not abstract policy debates. They are real children who would almost certainly have survived under the healthcare system Cuba maintained even during the special period. and who are now dying or suffering permanent damage because the fuel, the foreign currency, the spare parts, and the imported medicines the entire system depended upon have been cut off or priced beyond reach. Food production has followed exactly the same downward trajectory. State farms and agricultural cooperatives, already inefficient after decades of central planning and lack of incentives for individual farmers, have been further crippled by the absence of fuel for tractors and irrigation pumps, fertilizer that can no longer be imported in adequate quantities, and spare parts for aging machinery. Independent estimates and reports from inside the island indicate output drops of up to 60% in some key sectors compared with pre-crisis levels. The famous ration book that once guaranteed at least a minimal caloric intake for every citizen now delivers less and less each month, and even those meager allotments frequently fail to arrive on schedule. Private farmers and small producers, who could potentially fill some of the gaps, remain heavily restricted by regulations, lack of credit, and inability to obtain seeds, tools, and fuel on the open market. As a result, Cuba has become even more dependent on imported food at precisely the moment when it has the least hard currency available to pay for those imports. Tourism, which had been one of the last relatively reliable sources of foreign exchange, has collapsed under the combined weight of prolonged blackouts, fuel shortages that make internal travel difficult, and the visible humanitarian crisis that has made many potential visitors reluctant to come. Hotels that once welcomed plane loads of Europeans and Canadians now sit half-empty or completely dark. The formal economy is shrinking month by month. The only sector that continues to expand is the quiet, desperate economy of daily survival through whatever means necessary. Faced with this reality, hundreds of thousands of Cubans have made the only rational calculation left to them. They have left the island. Since the wave of protests in 2021 and the deepening economic crisis that followed, more than 1 million people, with some independent demographers and population researchers putting the true figure closer to 1.8 million, have departed. This is the largest single exodus in Cuban history, surpassing even the Muriel boat lift of 1980 and the Balsero raft crisis of 1994. Crucially, those leaving are not primarily the elderly or the unskilled. They are young adults, trained professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, nurses, and entire young families, precisely the demographic cohort the country most needs if it is ever to have any hope of rebuilding a functioning economy and society. Many traveled the extremely dangerous overland route through Nicaragua and then north through Central America, crossing the notorious Darien Gap jungle on foot before riding buses and trains toward the U.S. southern border. Others risk their lives in small boats attempting the Florida Straits. The regime has responded with its usual mixture of limited pragmatic openings, such as allowing some diaspora investment in certain sectors, combined with continued tight political control and surveillance over those who remain on the island. But the outflow continues unabated. Cuba's population is aging at an accelerating rate. The working-age population is shrinking. Every doctor who reaches Miami or Madrid represents another rural clinic that can no longer provide even basic care. Every young engineer who leaves is one less person who might have stayed to maintain the crumbling power grid or design solutions to the food crisis. The human capital flight is now as severe as the energy and medicine shortages. What makes the present crisis fundamentally different from the special period of the 1990s is that this time, there is no new external patron waiting in the wings to provide another oxygen tank. The Soviet Union is long gone. Venezuela's subsidized oil has been cut to a trickle or stopped entirely. Russia and China offer some limited economic and diplomatic support, but nothing approaching the scale of previous subsidies in either volume or reliability. The regime has fallen back on the familiar playbook it has used for more than 60 years, blaming every shortage and every failure on Washington, tightening internal repression against any public expression of discontent, and insisting that resistance itself constitutes a form of victory. There have been a few small, carefully managed signals of pragmatism. The quiet release of selected political prisoners, public statements from President Miguel Diaz-Canel acknowledging the need for urgent changes, and reported diplomatic feelers seeking some form of relief. But these moves increasingly look less like the confident actions of a government that believes it can adapt and survive, and more like the defensive maneuvers of a system that has finally run out of external excuses and is being forced to confront the full consequences of its own internal design flaws. Those structural contradictions are not new. They have been present since the earliest years of the revolution. A system of centralized state control without meaningful economic incentives for productivity or innovation inevitably produces chronic inefficiency, waste, and corruption. State enterprises that cannot go bankrupt and whose managers are rewarded for political loyalty rather than results continue to consume resources that could be used elsewhere. Technological upgrading and genuine innovation are stifled because risk-taking is politically dangerous and because the system provides almost no rewards for individual initiative or entrepreneurship. The revolution's early and very real gains in literacy, basic healthcare, and social mobility were achieved, but they were achieved within a model that could only be sustained over the long term by someone else's money and someone else's oil. When those external inputs disappeared or were dramatically reduced, the underlying weaknesses, chronically low productivity, technological stagnation, a rapidly aging and shrinking population, and a political system that has always been far more effective at punishing dissent than at rewarding competence or solving practical problems, were exposed with nowhere left to hide. This is not simply the story of American sanctions finally succeeding after 6 decades. It is the story of a socioeconomic and political model whose internal logic was always incompatible with sustainable, independent prosperity. Socialism on the island could function after a fashion, when it was heavily subsidized from outside. Without that subsidy, the mathematics no longer add up. The human cost of that terminal failure is measured every day in darkened hospital corridors, in hungry children who go to bed without enough to eat, and in the long lines at airports and border crossings, as families make the wrenching decision to leave everything they have ever known. It is measured in the quiet, late-night conversations between husbands and wives about whether to risk the dangerous journey north or to stay and try to survive one more year. It is measured in the growing mountains of uncollected garbage on street corners and the rising anxiety about epidemics that once seemed like problems belonging to a different century. The regime still controls the security forces, the official media, and the mechanisms of political repression. It can still arrest dissidents, shut down independent journalists, and maintain the outward appearance of control. But it cannot make the electricity stay on for more than a few hours at a time. It cannot make the essential medicines appear on pharmacy shelves. It cannot make the hundreds of thousands of young professionals and skilled workers who have already left come back. Those are the hard, non-negotiable limits of political power when the economic and energetic foundations of the state have crumbled. The regional and international consequences are already beginning to spread. A further acceleration of migration from Cuba would place additional enormous pressure on already strained transit countries in Central America, on Mexico's southern and northern borders, and on the United States' capacity to process and integrate new arrivals. Political or social instability in Cuba could create openings for criminal networks involved in human trafficking and drug smuggling, or for other external powers seeking influence in the Caribbean. For other governments around the world that have experimented with similar centralized, subsidy-dependent models, or that have relied on a single powerful patron for economic survival, the Cuban example offers a stark and timely lesson. External subsidies and ideological solidarity can paper over deep structural failures for a remarkably long time. They cannot do so indefinitely. When the patron withdraws, collapses, or is removed from the equation, the accumulated bill comes due all at once, and the internal weaknesses that were masked for decades are suddenly laid bare for everyone to see. For ordinary Cubans living through this crisis, the central question is no longer theoretical or political in any abstract sense. How much longer can a system that cannot reliably feed its population, power its hospitals and water systems, or retain the skilled workers it spent decades training continue to hold together? The regime has survived previous crises by making limited tactical adjustments at the margins, while preserving the core structures of centralized political and economic control. But the current combination of energy system collapse, accelerating demographic hemorrhage, and the complete absence of any credible new external lifeline is different in both scale and nature. This is not simply another painful cycle of hardship that will eventually be followed by reluctant, limited reforms. This appears to be the visible end stage of a model that was never designed to stand on its own feet for any extended period. The lights going out across the island night after night are not merely a technical failure of an old electrical grid. They are the clearest and most undeniable signal yet that the socialist experiment, as it has been practiced in Cuba for more than 60 years, has reached the limit of what external support and internal repression can sustain. Cuba's regime is finished because socialism's epic failure is dying in real time, exposed by the sudden loss of its last remaining external lifeline and crushed by the accumulated weight of its own structural contradictions. The darkened streets of Havana and Santiago are not just a power outage, they are the most visible symptom of a system that has finally run out of borrowed time. The question that now hangs over the island is not whether the old model can be preserved or restored in something close to its historic form. The real question is what comes next. Whether any transition will be managed and relatively peaceful or chaotic and potentially violent, and whether the Cuban people will at last be permitted to build institutions and an economy that do not require constant rescue from abroad in order to provide basic security, dignity, and opportunity for the generations still to come. What shocked you the most about the situation unfolding in Cuba right now? Do you believe the current leadership can move quickly enough toward genuine structural reforms to prevent a complete societal breakdown? Or do you see this as the irreversible beginning of the end for the regime? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you want to keep following the hidden stories of collapsing systems, demographic shifts, and the forces quietly reshaping nations around the world, make sure you are subscribed and have turned on notifications so you never miss a new video. There is much more coming, and almost none of it is going to be reassuring. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.